We have different aspects to cover in this course. Essentially, how to deploy and manage Microsoft Exchange Server, plan and configure mailbox server, manage recipient object, planning and deploying client access servers, planning, configuring message transport, and introducing to cloud model. As we see before, the course describe how to connect data center system, devices, networks, and application. So we have different aspects to discover. We have also in module 7 configuring private cloud environment and deploying cloud services, monitoring cloud-based application, and configuring application performance monitoring. So for the reference, you have 2 books. You can search, web search for this book. If you have any difficulty, I have a copy for this book. I try to give you course slide, but maybe chapter by chapter, not all slides at once, because I have not yet prepared all course slides. So for detailed content we have in the module 1, deploying and managing Microsoft Exchange Server 2013. Lesson 1, we have Exchange Server 2013 requirements, prerequisites and requirements. Lesson 2, Exchange Server 2013 deployment. And lesson 3, managing Exchange Server 2013. So we have 3 aspects. For the module 2, we have planning and configuring mailbox server, overview of mailbox servers role, planning mailbox server deployment, and configuring the mailbox servers. Module 3 cover the management of recipient object, managing Exchange Server 2013 mailbox, managing other Exchange recipient, planning and implementing public folder mailbox. And in the 4th section, we have managing address list and policies. Module 4 cover planning and deploying client access servers. In the lesson 1, we have planning client access server deployment. Lesson 2, configuring the client access server role. Lesson 3, managing client access services. Module 5 cover planning and configuring message transport. Lesson 1, overview of message transport and routing. Lesson 2 cover planning and configuring message transport. And lesson 3, managing transport rules. In module 6, we introduce the cloud model, overview of the cloud model, computing model requirement for private cloud. So it is a trend actually to use the cloud services for storage, for computation, for simulation, for also writing program and executing program for database, for distributed database, and so on. So you have a lot of services cloud-based. So it is very interesting to discover this area. In lesson 3, we have a requirement for public or hybrid cloud. So as you know, there is a lot 3 essential type of cloud: private cloud, public, and hybrid. Hybrid cloud is between private and public. Some aspects are private and other aspects are public. Then we have in lesson 4 operating a hybrid cloud infrastructure with system center. And lesson 5 maintaining the health of cloud, integrating system center component. In lesson 7 configuring private cloud environment, we see overview of system center 2012 relates to virtual machine manager and managing the virtual environment with the virtual machine manager. And lesson 3, creating clouds. In lesson or module 8, deploying cloud services, we see the overview of services templates, VMM profiles, web deploy package, overview of server app v, data tier application package, deploying service through application controller, and module 9, monitoring cloud-based applications. We have 5 aspects. The first one, overview of system client 2012, relates to operations manager. Agent deployment in operations manager. Configuring custom monitoring, monitoring the network infrastructure, monitoring distributed applications. And the last module, module 10, configuring application performance monitoring. We have application performance monitoring, advanced monitoring in APM, viewing application performance data in operating manager. So this is for the theoretical part, and you have some labs. For practical content, you will see in the practical section with your teacher. You have essentially 10 labs. Labs are widely connected to the course, so it is important to understand theoretical notion in order to make practice, and you will cover all the necessary aspect of this course. This is for the content of the course. It is very interesting. So it is different from data center operation 1, because data center operation 1, essentially we cover data center infrastructure and devices, networks, protocols. But in data center operation 2, essentially we deal with the operating system and Microsoft Exchange server. So let's begin with module 1. Or before beginning, is there any question concerning this introduction to the course? Is there any question? Is it okay? So there is no question. As I said before, I haven't all slides that cover all aspects of this course, but I will try to prepare every week. I will prepare the content concerning the course. So let's start. So module 1, deploying and managing Microsoft Exchange Server 2013. So for this module, we have three parts. The first one concerns Exchange Server 2013 prerequisites and requirement, essentially software requirements and hardware requirements. Then we will see Exchange Server 2013 deployment. And third one, managing Exchange Server 2013. For the first part, the lesson objectives are describe Active Directory component and Exchange Server integrations. Describe domain name system, DNS server requirement for Exchange Server. Describe software requirements for Exchange Server 2013. Describe hardware requirements for Exchange Server 2013, and describe infrastructure requirement for Exchange Server 2013. Prepare Active Directory domain services for an Exchange Server 2013 deployment. So as you see, the course is very close to the Windows Server and network administration too. So it is really related to Windows Server. So here we will review some aspects that we see before in Windows Server. So Active Directory component and Exchange Server integration. As you know, Active Directory information is divided into 4 partitions. We have domain, configuration, schema, and application. These directory partition are the replication unit in Active Directory domain services. For domain partition contains all objects in the domains directory. Domain object replicate to every domain controller in the domain and include user and computer account and groups. A subset of domain partition replicates to all domain controllers in the forest that are global catalog servers. As you know, and you have here for the forest. You have exchange, organization, and Active Directory for the forests. Exchange, organization, and Active Directory forest one-to-one relationship. So this is the configuration. We have domain partition. The subset of the domain partition replicate to all domain controller in the forest that are global catalog server. So we can consider the forest as a global catalog servers. If you configure a domain controller as a global catalog server, it contains a complete copy of its own domains, objects, and subset of attribute for every domain's object in the forest. In order to configure the partition, the configuration partition contains configuration information. So for the configuration, we have configuration information for Active Directory services, servers, and application, including Active Directory site-to-site link information. So this is for the configuration. For the configuration, we have exchange configuration, site-to-site. So this is exchange of information. In addition, some distributed application and services store information in the configuration partition. This information replicates through the entire forest so that each domain controller retain a replica of the configuration partition. So we will have some kinds of a copy of the configuration in every server. So each domain controller retain a replica of the configuration partition. When application developer choose to store application information in the configuration partition, the developer do not need to create their own mechanism to replicate the information. The configuration partition store each type of configuration information in separate containers. A container is an Active Directory object similar to organizational unit or OU. So you have here Active Directory object, the same thing as organizational unit or OU that is used to organize other objects. For the schema partition, the schema partition contains definition information for all object types and their attribute that you can create in Active Directory domain services. So the schema partition contains definition information for all object types and their attribute that you can create in Active Directory domain service. This data is common to all domains in the forest. And Active Directory domain service replicate it to all domain controller. So we have the same thing as we see before. So the schema also replicate the same thing. So here, exchange object, classes, and attribute. As we see for the configuration, we have the same configuration. Change the configuration. Schema also. The data are common to all domain in the forest and active domain service. Replicate it to all domain controller in the forest. However, only one domain controller maintains a readable copy of the schema. By default, this domain controller, known as schema master, is the first domain controller installed in an Active Directory forest. So the first domain controller installed in an Active Directory forest will be a domain controller, the only one who maintains a readable copy of the schema. A readable copy that we can modify. The other are a copy that we can read, but we cannot modify. So the first domain controller installed in an Active Directory forest will be the only one domain controller that maintain a readable copy of the schema. For the application partition now, for the application partition, we have an administrator can create application partition manually, as we see before. In network administration too, the administrator can create application partition manually, and an application can automatically create a partition during its installation process. Application partition holds specific application data that the application requires. The main benefits of application partition is replication flexibility. You can specify the domain controller that hold a replica of an application partition, and these domain controllers can include a subset of domain controllers through the forest. Exchange Server 2013 does not use application partition to store information. So Exchange Server 2013 does not use application partition to store information. We have also Exchange Server 2013 and Active Directory Domain Server partition integration to ensure proper placement of Active Directory component in relation to computer that are running Exchange Server. So we have in the domain, we have computer that can run Exchange Server. You must understand how Exchange Server 2013 communicate with Active Directory domain services and use Active Directory information to function. Active Directory domain servers store most Exchange servers 2013 configuration confirmation. So the Active Directory domain server store most Exchange server 2013 configuration information. An Exchange Server organization and Active Directory forest have a one-to-one relationship. So Exchange Server organization and Active Directory forest have one-to-one relationship. So direct relationship between the Exchange Server organization and Active Directory forest. You cannot have an Exchange Server organization that span multiple Active Directory forests. You also you cannot have multiple Exchange Server organization within a single Active Directory forest. In Exchange Server 2013, you can also add Office 365 domain to Exchange Admin Center console. This enables you to manage multiple organizations from a single management console. So you can also add Office 365 domain in order to manage multiple organizations from a single management console. So for the schema partition, we have Exchange Server 2013 installation process. Modify the schema partition to enable the creation of Exchange Server specific object. The installation process also add Exchange Server specific attribute to existing objects. For example, the installation process update user object with additional attribute to describe storage quota and mailbox future. So we see this when we see the mailbox configuration. We have also the configuration partition. The configuration partition store configuration information for the Exchange Server 2013 organization. Because Active Directory domain server replicate the configuration partition among all domain controller in the forest. Configuration of Exchange Server 2013 organization replicate through the forest. The configuration partition include Exchange Server configuration object such as global settings, email address policy, transport rules, and address list. This is for the configuration partition. So the configuration partition include Exchange Server configuration object such as global settings, email addresses, policy, transport rules, and address list. This is for the configuration partition. We have also the domain partition. The domain partition holds information about recipient object. This include mailbox enabled user and mail enabled user, group, and contacts. Objects that are mailbox enabled or mail enabled have pre-configured attributes such as email addresses. So for the domain partition, it holds information about the recipient object. For example, a mailbox enabled user and mail enabled user, group, and contacts. We have also a global catalog. We have the last global catalog. Global catalog essentially used when you install Exchange Server 2013. The email attributes for email enabled and mailbox enabled object replicate to the global catalog in the context of Exchange Server. A global catalog is used for the following. The global address list is generated from the recipient list in Active Directory Forest Global Catalog. Exchange Server 2013 Transport Services access the global catalog to find the location of the recipient mailbox when delivering message. So when delivering message, Exchange Server 2013 Transport Service access the global catalog to find the location of a recipient mailbox. A client access server access the global catalog server also to locate the user mailbox server and to display the global address list to Microsoft Office Outlook or Microsoft Outlook web app or Exchange Active Synchronization Client. So here this mailbox server. For example, you can use the global address list to Microsoft Office Outlook or Microsoft Outlook web application or Exchange active synchronization clients. So this is for the notion of forest, schema, configuration, domain, and global catalog. This is for the essential notion to manage the Microsoft Exchange deployment. Now we will have DNS server requirement for Exchange Server 2013. Each computer that is running Exchange server, as we said before, in domain controller, we can have some computer that have Exchange server. Each computer that is running Exchange server must use DNS to locate Active Directory domain servers and the global catalog servers. Very important. So each computer that is running Exchange server must use DNS to locate Active Directory domain servers and the global catalog servers. The site-aware application Exchange Server 2013 prefers to communicate with domain controller that are located in the same site as the computer that is running Exchange server. So usually the computer will try to connect the same with the domain controller in the same site. Exchange server services use DNS to locate a valid domain controller or global catalog. By default, each time a domain controller starts, the net login service is updated to domain name system. So DNS with service. To ensure that the domain controller update DNS records properly, it is essential that all domain controllers use an internal DNS server that support dynamic updates after DNS records are registered. So we'll use the domain name system to record the registered computer that are running Exchange server. Computer that are running Exchange server can use DNS to find domain controller and global catalog server. This is the essential idea for this. So each computer that is running Exchange server must use DNS to locate Active Directory domain server and the global catalog server. So we have Exchange Server 2013 use DNS to locate Active Directory domain server, domain controllers, and registered it with service SRV records. So SRV record, service records. So service records that describe the server as domain controller and global catalog server. The second point, we have Exchange Server 2013 use following record type. We have, as we said before, service SRV records, as we said, that describe the server as domain controller and global catalog server, the host record, and mixed records. So for the SRV resource record, SRV resource record are DNS record that identify servers that provide specific service on the network. For example, SRV resource record can contain information to help a client locate a domain controller in a specific domain or site. All SRV resource records use a standard format, which consists of several files that contain information that Active Directory domain server use to map the service back to the computer that provide the service. The SRV records for domain controller and the global catalog server are registered with different variation to allow locating domain controller and global catalog servers in several different ways. One option is to register domain name system. So we can register domain name system records by site name, which enable computers that are running Exchange server to find domain controller and the global catalog server in the local Active Directory site. Exchange server always perform DNS resource query for the local Active Directory site first. So always the Exchange server perform DNS resource query at the beginning for the local Active Directory site first. Always it search in local Active Directory site. Then if it is not fine, it will search for other site. So SRV resource record use the following format. So we have so for the SRV resource record use this format. We have the service dot protocol dot the name, the class, server, priority, weight, port, target. So this is the SRV resource record. So the service, the protocol, the name, the class, priority, weight, port, and target. So when a computer that is running Exchange server Exchange server is a member server, Exchange server configure it dynamically with its site each time it authenticate to Active Directory domain server. As a part of the authentication process, the registry store the site name. When the Exchange server requires DNS for domain controller or global catalog server records, the Exchange server always attempts to connect to domain controllers that have the same site attribute as Exchange server. So we need to know the computer that running Exchange server. If it is a member server, so the Exchange server configure it dynamically with its site each time it authenticates to Active Directory domain server. So this is a part of authentication process. When it is authenticated directly, if it has Exchange server, it will be configured dynamically with the site where it is authenticated. So this is for the SRV resource record. We have also the host record. Host records provide host name to IP address mapping. So the same thing as DNS. Host records provide host name to IP address mapping. Host records are required for each domain controller and other hosts that need to be accessible to Exchange server or client computers. Host records can use internal protocol version 4, for example, IP version 4, which are records, or Internet Protocol version 6, IP version 6 record, which are AAA records. So we can use IP version 4 or IP version 6 for host records. So we have the host name and IP address. Host record essentially provide host name to IP address mapping. This is the, but for the IP, it can be IP version 4 or IP version 6. If it is IP version 4, we say they are A record. So when we use IP version 4, we say we have A records. If it is IP version 6, we say we have A records. So here we have two things. If it is, I said, IP for host records. If it is IP version 6, so it is a host name. But if it is IP version 4, we call this A records. Always we have host name and IP. If we use IP version 6, we call this A records. So this is for host records. For the mail exchanger records or MX, so MX or mail exchanger records. For mail exchanger records, it is a resource record that allows servers to locate other servers to deliver internet email by using the simple mail transfer protocol or SMTP. So we'll use SMTP or simple mail transfer protocol. NMX record identify the SMTP server that will accept inbound message for a specific DNS domain. Each mail exchanger record contains a host name and a preference value. When you deploy multiple SMTP servers that are accessible for the internet, you can assign equal preference value to each mail exchanger record. To enable load balancing between the SMTP server. So for the mail exchanger, it uses the SMTP or simple mail transfer protocol. When you deploy multiple SMTP servers that are accessible from the internet, you can assign equal preference value to each mail exchanger record to enable load balancing between the SMTP server. As we said before, load balancing accelerate the access, for example, to the email or any other services. You also can specify a lower preference value for one of the mail exchanger records. All messages are routed through the SMTP server that has the lower preference value. So we can assign a value for preference for the mail exchanger unless that the server is not available. If it is not available, you cannot access. So this is for the second part for Exchange server. The record concern SRV records. As we said, for SRV records, essentially that identifies server that provides specific service on the network. It contains information to help client to locate a domain controller in the specific domain or site. This is for SRV resource record, essentially. So data or information about server or DNS. So they are the DNS record. The last thing is an addition DNS records may be needed for sender policy framework and sender ID. Now we will see software requirement for Exchange Server 2013. 2013. So Exchange Server 2013 can be installed on Windows Server 2012 standard or data center. Windows Server 2008 release 2 standard with SP1. Windows Server 2008 release 2 enterprise with SP1. SP1 is essentially an extension to the operating system that contains some feature. Otherwise, it contains also Exchange Server. Windows Server 2008 release 2 data center, RTM or later. This is for the requirement. So Exchange Server 2013 require that some software be pre-installed before you start the deployment process. First, you should plan for the operating system platform that will be used for Exchange Server 2013. The following operating system are supported for installation of Exchange Server 2013 roles. As we said before, we have Windows Server 2012 standard or data center, Windows Server 2008 release 2 standard with server pack 1, or 2008 release 2 enterprise with server pack 2. Also Windows Server 2008 release 2 data center, RTM or newer. There is a remark: server core installation option is not supported operating system option for Exchange Server 2013 installation. In addition, Windows Server 2008 release 2 standard does not support failover clustering and cannot use database available group that we call DAG, database available group, in Exchange Server for high availability. You cannot upgrade Windows Server after you have installed Exchange. This is very important remark. You cannot upgrade Windows Server after you have installed Exchange. So you must be careful if you project to upgrade Windows Server. If you install Exchange, you cannot upgrade Windows Server. Depending on which, or you will need to reconfigure Windows Exchange or Exchange Server future after upgrading Windows Server. So depending on which Exchange Server role is installed, different Windows component can be installed on the server. However, you do not need to install these roles and future prior to Exchange Server installation, because the installation process can install the necessary role and future automatically. So when you install, it will be automatically installed. However, there are additional components that you should install manually. This component freely available to download from Microsoft. It includes Microsoft.NET Framework 4.5, for example, for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 release 2. Also, Windows Management Framework 3. So this additional component will be automatically added, not so when you install a Server Exchange Server directly, it will be added, and it is available to download from Microsoft. Also, Remote Server Administration Tools, or RSAT. remote server administration tools for Active Directory server. Microsoft Unified Communication Managed API 4.0 core runtime 64 bits. Microsoft Office 2012 filter pack 64 bit. Microsoft Office 2012 filter pack service pack 1 64 bit. Exchange server upgrade for knowledge base article. You have KB 974405 and some other requirements. You also should ensure that the task schedule server is enabled and running on the server when you plan to install Exchange Server 2013. So the task schedule service is enabled and running on the server when you plan to install Exchange Server 2013. So we must ensure that the task schedule service is enabled and running on the server when you plan to install Exchange Server 2013. In addition, you should check if the net.tcp port sharing service is set to automatic. So we must check if net.tcp port sharing service is set to automatic on the server when you plan to install the Exchange Server Client Access Server role. This is for the software requirement. So we have software requirement for Exchange Server. So this is for the software. So we need Exchange Server 2013. When do we have to have a Windows Server 2012 or 2008 release 2 with Service Pack 1 or Standard Edition or Enterprise, or also Windows Server 2008 release 2 Data Center RTM or later. For additional components are available directly on Microsoft, so we don't care for this, but just the important remark that you must ensure that the task schedule service is enabled and running on the server when you plan to install Exchange Server 2013. In addition, you should check if the net.tcp port sharing service is set to automatic on the server where you plan to install Exchange Server Client Access Server role. Now we will see the hardware requirement. Hardware requirement for Exchange Server 2013. We have the resource and the requirement. For the processor, as we this is before maybe 10 years or 8 years. So the processor is Intel 64-bit architecture. So the infrastructure, it must be about 64-bit architecture, not 32, or AMD 64 architecture. So it can be either Intel or AMD. For the memory, recommended 8 gigabytes. Additional memory required based on server roles and load. So if we have a lot of machine and a lot of computer that have Exchange Server, we must maybe, or we need more than 8 gigabytes for the memory. For the disk, 1.2 gigabit free disk space for Exchange server file. So it takes 1.2 gigabit and 200 megabit free on the system drive. Also additional space for mailbox storage. For the file system, we use NTFS, new technology file system, NTFS file system for all drives. So we must have NTFS file system for all drives, not FAT, not other file system. So for the first, the server role that is installed has a significant influence on hardware specification. For example, the mailbox server likely requires more powerful hardware than the client access server does. Second, many organizations install all Exchange server roles on a single computer, which means that you must merge hardware requirement for each of the roles. So we have, for example, for the the processor for an Exchange server computer must be a 64-bit architecture based Intel process that support Intel 64 architecture, formerly known as Intel EM64T, or AMD process that support the AMD 64 platform. Also, we can use Intel Titanium IA64 process for not supported. For the memory, it is recommended that you consider using the maximum server memory configuration when deciding on the amount of RAM memory that you need for Exchange Server 2013. Different server architecture have different memory limits. Check the following technical specification for server to determine the most cost-efficient maximum memory configuration. So we have memory speed, memory module size, total number of memory slot. But as you know, essentially for the RAM, you can use, for example, the minimum required is 8 gigabit, but you can use, for example, 32 gigabit with PC3, DDR3, or 128 gigabit using PC2, DDR2, 800. So we must check with the manufacturer to ensure that the memory configuration target for Exchange Server 2013 is compatible in terms of speed. So this is the case for all the time, from the personal computer to the server also. Now you must check the manufacturer website to ensure that the hardware is compatible with the RAM speed. Essentially, when you use, for example, DDR3 or DDR2 or any other memory. So memory module size, consider choosing the largest memory module size that the server support. Generally, the larger the memory module, the more expensive it is. Make sure that the maximum memory module size allow you to meet your target memory requirement for Exchange Server 2013. Total number of memory slots, consider how many memory module a specific server will support. The total number of slots multiplied by the maximum memory module size provide the maximum memory configuration for the server. Keep in mind that memory module sometimes must be installed in pairs. Sometimes when you install memory, you must install in pairs. You cannot install only, for example, one slot, and the other slot is not installed. Sometimes you must check for the specification, essentially the manufacturer specification, to ensure that you use the right installation. For example, if it is recommended that you use the installation in pair, you must install in pair. You cannot install one slot and the other one is not installed. Some server experience performance improvement when more memory slots are filled, while other experience a reduction in performance. So you can check this by a simple search in the internet. If you have servers, you can check if you install more memory, is it benefit for your infrastructure, or it will reduce the performance of your server. Check with your hardware vendor to understand this effect on your server architecture. For the disk space, when choosing and configuring disk drive for Exchange Server 2013 installation, you should consider the following. You need at least 1.2 gigabit on the drive on which you install Exchange Server 2013. All partition that, this is very important, all partition that Exchange Server 2013 will use must be formatted with NTFS file system. An additional 500 megabit of available disk space for each unified messaging language pack that you plan to install, and 200 megabit of available disk space on the system drive. The space required for the mailbox server role cannot be determined without knowing the number of mailbox. It depends on the number of mailbox size. So you must know the number of mailbox. For example, if you have 1,000 employee or 1,000 student or 5,000 employee, you must ensure that the amount of memory cover all your needs. So here the number of mailbox, the mailbox size also, how you will give for the mailbox size, for example, 1 giga or 2 giga or 10 giga or 15 or 20. When we say unlimited, there is no unlimited mailbox size. But for example, 50 giga or 100 gigabit, and it is shared for all mailbox and high availability requirement among other parameters. We recommend you that you use the mailbox server role calculator to determine optimal hardware requirement for the mailbox server role. We can take 10 minutes for prior, then we come back and we complete this chapter. 10 minutes for prior and we come back, okay?